Hello, welcome everyone. You know, we probably should be, unlike the real living room, we should be a little higher so everyone could see clearly. I'm sorry about that, but it is intimate, which makes it perfect, because we have such a treat tonight to have a conversation with Janet Halley. Janet and I were just talking. Her title is the Royal Professor of Law at Harvard Law School, and but Royal spelled R-O-Y-A-L-L. And so I was asking, well, how do you pronounce that word? And apparently there's a story. Can you tell us, Janet, what this story is?
Well, this is an amazing place to start. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you, David, for inviting me.
I'm going to come back, but I don't want to lose this story.
Here. Well, Isaac Royal is the founding donor of my law school.
Yeah.
And he was a British loyalist living in Boston, who was negotiating back and forth between the revolutionaries and the Brits, trying to prevent the outbreak of the war. When the Battle of Lexington came, he thought that this was going to put him on the bad side of history, and he fled to Nova Scotia and then to London, where he soon after got smallpox and died. But in the meantime, he wrote a will leaving his property to Harvard University to establish a school of physics or law. And when they realized that they had the money, they established a school of law. But the thorn in the story is that he was the largest slave owner in all of Massachusetts, because his family came from the West Indies. I'm going to gap on the island. It'll come back to me at an inopportune late moment later. And they have the slave quarters, a Southern-style slave quarters. In Massachusetts, slavery was household slavery, but they had between 13 and 35 slaves. And so my line is, and has become, this is the founding money of my law school. It's slave labor that enabled the Harvard University to start a law school. And I accidentally became the Royal Professor and just think it's my job to let people know. A self-assigned duty.
Yeah, you are performing the remedy. You
Attempting.
live out the remedy.
Attempting.
So we have an hour and a half for this conversation, and you're going to be, let me describe what basically my plan is.
Yeah.
And that is, we're going to talk a little bit about how you come to your work, what you bring to your work, how you were trained, in recognition that as scholars, that's not an unimportant thing. And then there are many strands to your work. Certainly family law, military, don't ask, don't tell within the U.S. But Janet is here in association with Prabha Kotiswaran of the law faculty for a conference that they have together conceived, thought out this last 2 days on trafficking. And part of your work, Janet, is bringing concepts in the United States, such as feminism, to international questions. And so partly maybe we'll start, secondly, with that. And so some questions in the beginning, after sort of that section, and then after the next, and we'll see how you start to have questions as well as the discussion goes. So I'll turn to you for questions you might want to add in as we go along. And then we have time for reception after. So it's a real pleasure to have you here. Thank you for the story about the title of your chair.
Yeah.
And so my understanding is you took a doctorate in English before you went to law school, and that was at UCLA, and you worked on Milton in
That's
particular.
Right. Yeah.
So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this interest in English and in literature, and how that forms how you approach law school, how that all sort of wove together.
Oh, thank you. I studied English literature. I studied 17th century non-dramatic poetry was my specialization. When I first saw the book with that title, I thought, this is so esoteric. No one would ever even read more than 5 pages, and I spent 10 years of my life on it. Marvelous, wonderful work. And my topic at the beginning was the problem of inexpressibility, the problem of things that cannot be said. And it was mostly spiritual inexpressibility, what you could call God talk. When you get, there are places in Milton's poetry where the grammar goes offline and the intelligibility goes way down, and something prophetic may be on its way, and so the poetry really changes. But that morphed into writing about Jesuits in England during the Elizabethan and Jacobean era, and then that morphed into my work on the closet of gays and lesbians in the United States. So I was interested in the way people talk when the things that they want to say aren't okay, and yet they have this drive to express, or the things that they have to say are too much for language, and so there was a kind of continuity for me, but there was also a big break. I did experience the onset. Oh, come on in, people. There's some chairs.
Yes, there
left
are.
in front, and not that many, but there's definitely more room than in that doorway.
There's 2 in the very front and 1 in the second row.
Yeah, and we can get more fresh air too if we need it. There was a break in literary study at that time about the new criticism and really close reading and understanding the minute operations of language and the political context. And it was really through Milton that I made that transition to the politics of poetry. Milton was a revolutionary. He had to go underground at the time of the English Revolution, and again, I'm really interested in those transitions. When politics changes so much that the things that you were authorized to say, paid to say, should say, became the prohibited. Of course, that happens all around us all the time. And he went through that. And I discovered that through Christopher Hill, the Marxist historian of Milton and the English Revolution, and that just kind of exploded into my literary criticism and propelled me towards law. So
Wait, that propelled you toward law.
And I didn't understand at the time, and I remember I was a clerk, and I was making the bed in my little single apartment, clerking for a judge, and I thought, wow, this business of being a lawyer is going to make me really normal. But that was after law school, and it didn't occur to me for a really long time how the relationship between the normal and the deviant, or the normal and the inexpressible, would be somehow for some people not legal, right? And I've always thought it was. So.
So I've had students who come to me and to law school because they're interested in an international question.
Yeah.
And then they're very frustrated with their first year of law school because it's anything but what they came for.
Yeah.
So did you, how did the core of some of your law school experience relate to was part of you always watching the inexpressible in what was in front of you?
I was 35 when I went to law school. I had already been professionalized. I already had published. The teachers weren't the same people to me that they would have been if I was the right age. And so I remember leaving some classes because approaching law as a language was ruled out, and just deciding, no, this is going to be pointless for me. But there was plenty of room to move within the law for me, and of course, if I know some of our students are very disappointed because they come to law school for answers. And law doesn't provide answers. The political struggles that go on inside law get you provisional answers, but those can be dismantled, as we see rather quickly. So I think of law as a series of inquiries or series of questions and a series of linguistic patchings over. And that has never, I didn't have that disillusionment because I didn't have the hope.
So the only thing I'm wondering if there are questions in the audience about this, because the British legal education experience can be different in this way. I just left
I'm sure it is.
a panel. Well, in part, I think there's a question of whether you learn a law as though it is the law,
Yeah.
or whether you learn the law and become qualified in a law in time. And it's really, systems are quite different in ways, but you certainly had a privilege in seeing law as a political act all along, from what you're saying.
Yeah, I was lucky.
So I'm not hearing, I heard in part, three things that are coming through in your work that will follow after law school, which is, maybe I'm incorrect here, so correct me. So let me say, I'm going to play the straight man because this is not my area. But feminism, sexuality, gender, and they become very important pieces of your work. Or am I simplifying?
True. No, that's really true.
And this literary reading is part of that. So I'm wondering how we can enter into your work. I can point to specific pieces of work. But perhaps we could start with what was striking you over these past 2 days, this discussion you've had with 20 scholars about trafficking, and how do these concepts weave in that to you?
Well, boy, we've had a really rich 2 days, and I want to thank Prabha again for organizing such a great conference. It was an invitational event, and it brought together ethnographers and members and former members of the ILO and a number of people from trafficking roundtables. There's some members in the audience. I see Denise Brennan, Carrie Riddick, who've been trying, and Aziza Ahmed in the back. Hila Shamir came through from the conference. And we've been feeling very, and Sally Mary is in my eye line. We've been feeling ambivalent about the trafficking system since we first encountered it, which it's now 13, 14 years old. And it is
the system. So since it's come into being.
Yeah, it was invented, and I mean, there was a international law of trafficking, but it was really exclusively prostitution and child prostitution from the early 19th century and the middle early, interwar period. But 2000 Palermo Protocol, big deal, U.S. TV, a statute on trafficking, and since then a ton of money and a ton of institutionalization feeding in. What is this new thing, and how does it relate to distributive questions about what does really help the poor people of the world? And is the trafficking system going to help them? Is it helping them? Does it hurt them? Who benefits? What kinds of employers listen to it? What kinds use it against their workers? So we're interested in taking, I think we're all, I don't want to speak for everybody, but I got this feeling that there's a strong sense of the group that you convene that a labor perspective on this system is what needs to focus, be brought into focus, but the organized forms of labor and of labor law are really different from the techniques that are built into the trafficking system, which are, primordial, kind of centrally criminal. So So what do people see are the moving parts and the capacities and the blockages and the boomerangs? That's what we were talking about, and it was, and to make the literary connection, I was looking around the room and watching people doing interpretation all the time. They could be talking about the same piece of paper, but they would say really different things were on that piece of paper, and that's that activity of interpretation that makes for free play even when you're learning a law, I think.
Yeah.
Some level of free play, not infinite, but some. Does that make sense?
No, that
Yeah.
does make sense. Can I bring out two concepts that were there, and you can say more? So partly there's a critique of a system, and how do you situate yourself to do that critique? But you use the word to have a distributional look, a distributional analysis, not only a cost-benefit analysis or aggregate increase in wealth or something like that. But so could you say, is your critique using that in particular? Is that important to you?
It is important to me, and I teach it, and I find that if I pursue this effectively, I'll have a little how-to instruction sheet that you can take home and try this at home. The idea is to borrow from the economists the idea of cost-benefit analysis, but to add from the political sphere the idea of conflicts of interest in the society, and to add from the aesthetic sphere the idea that representation, representing social movements, representing the law, the spin that advocates put on law, the stuff you put in the footnote instead of in the text, and why, all of that converge in distributing costs and benefits along a wide array of interests. So never aggregate interests, conflicting interests, converging interests, and trying to see how the legal system is a mediating force in distributional activities, often struggles, often acts of immense generosity, not only self-interest, right? And so, yeah, we're trying to politicize what can be made objective by a more standard orthodox economic approach. Is that?
I think that is it. If I could try to be a partial translator, I mean, one thing I've noticed is the British system has a great emphasis on the philosophical implications, notions of justice, as they talk about the law. And so they seem to be constantly talking about distribution, although they might not use that word.
Yeah.
Whereas economics so infuses the American law school that the discussion becomes about, well, is this overall a better policy? Not being able really to say anything from the economic perspective about who benefits from that policy.
At whose cost.
So it may be a net increase in efficiency and therefore wealth, et cetera, but it leaves unanswered really what that means. And so it's it's an unusual critique in the U.S., a very important critique, and I think would have a lot of resonance with the emphasis taken.
I'll come back anytime I'm invited to find out more about this.
There's a lot of richness, I think, in the British Academy in this way.
We've seen that in the last 2 days too.
So can I just ask a different concept? I think you have coined, or you could give a greater genealogy to it, the idea of feminist governance, and which to me, in a way, the whole discussion you're having is partly that. But maybe you could explain that concept to everyone.
Thank you. This is, in some quarters, a very controversial thing to say. And it makes some people really mad. So
I think if anyone's getting mad, let me know.
Take this up. the thing that I began to notice as students came back from the summer jobs, working in big NGOs. In fact, I'm not sure Rachel Rebouchet is in this room. There she is. She's the one who really was the moment when it was triggered. We do learn from our students. She came to me after her summer job, and I won't remember, so I won't say where she was working, and she said, they weren't interested in my ideas. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. It was a sign of the turn of feminist NGOs towards a certain form of expertise, a consolidation of their knowledge, a consolidation of their program, and there was a mode of internal governance of the NGOs to keep everybody working in their sphere on program. And that was the tip-off for me that feminist ideas were moving from what I call the Vox Clemente and Deserto phase.
Please explain that.
Of the voice crying out in the wilderness,
Okay.
you know, the unheard prophet
All right.
calling out, I know the voice of God, listen to me, to the insider who has certain levers of power. Now, I'm working with Prabha and Hila and Rachel on a book on this, and we've discovered that there are ways that feminists can get into very consolidated state power of all different kinds, can get bounced off really hard, can work in the kind of quasi-state sphere, in the international arena, with its civil society increasingly becoming institutionalized. You know, the feminists have grown up with the institutionalization of the new civil society constructing international legal sphere. They were there from the beginning. And indeed, feminist ideas about how to network have been kind of reified as a form of international law. So there's a certain level of inclusion. We're just really interested in making a description of it. And the reason I think it's controversial is that there's a lot of feminist ideas that are totally not making it, and a lot of the times that you get built into the institutions, especially legal ones, you tend to disappear into them. There'll be a requirement of neutrality, or a requirement of objectivity, or a requirement of detachment, or loss of passion, or in some or expertise, or some other form of losing the political, and that we're really interested in that, but a lot of feminists experience that as defeat, and we're interested in that. We're interested in I don't know, would this seem appropriate? Maybe I'm the one who's most fascinated. The emotions that go with that. What makes people feel included and excluded, and interesting. It's interesting to make people so mad saying this.
Well, maybe we can make some people mad, make them realize what the implications is. I think it's a very important moment. You described it in part as it's a moment of partial triumph in one of your pieces.
Yeah.
That in part, feminism as the critique outside has won in some respects. And with that, something shifts. And it's that moment.
What? Yeah.
Well,
yeah. What is it?
Well,
is the question.
So in different terms, I chaired a conference where the whole thing was how do we address complexity as lawyers?
Yeah.
And I spent part of the talk describing what is a complexity. And but then part of the talk was, are we as lawyers really prepared to talk about complexities? Because we are so trained to actually be advocates. And by advocates, we privilege one aspect of something that is very complex, which is an important role. It's also a very privileged role, right? We just keep hammering our critique And in a way, I like the word governance, because governance moves toward responsibility for the complexity. It asks, well, what is the consequence of my advocacy? But you shouldn't lose the passion of the advocate either.
Yeah.
And so it's not really it's not that one loses one role, but the two roles of taking responsibility for really solving the complexity
Yeah.
of something with all its dualities, with all its opposing forces and trade-offs, and yet making sure the vision you had about what was important is still part of that. That's
Yeah.
it's a big challenge and a shift. At least
Yeah.
that's so I don't know, I'll throw it back to you.
Well, I'd love to hear what your answer to what is complexity. Yeah, well, I think that we're all complex over time. So we can change our mind, we can move into a space and make a change there and be wrong, and that might not kill us. You know, we might learn from that and move on through it. And I like that word responsible that you're bringing to the table. I do think that social movements that get some degree of power have responsibility. And what I would love to see for feminism was that would not be a style of mutual accusation. You know, you threw a legal boomerang and it hit you in the back of the head. Well, guess what? Legal boomerangs do that. They're going to hit you in the back of the head, or someone in the back of the head. Let's look at that. Let's learn from that. And to try to reduce the intensity of moral denunciation that goes with assessing back to distributional, the distributional analysis of the interventions that we make. So that's, I think when people hear governance feminism, they may anticipate that I'm saying betrayer, and or sellout, and that's not it at all. It's more this idea of responsibility through time. Also, I mean, you had a conference about complexity, but that's a different self of yours than your advocate self. You wouldn't pop up at the court and say, but judge, it really is a multi-dimensional hexagon with 7 feedback loops, and I really want you to understand that. You know, you wouldn't do that, but
Right.
but you got there partly because you had that. And
But if I was the legislator, then I would be listening to many advocates and
thinking,
and having my own passion, perhaps,
yeah,
but trying to think, as you were saying, in the detached way, or this demand that somehow you be detached, to be legitimate, to balance, to think of the whole. But the legal realist is coming through.
You're speaking to somebody who has to live with the United States Congress. Detachment is at its all-time low. So, yeah,
Right.
that's
Okay.
a slugfest.
Yeah, I got you. So let's move that discussion. Is there a question about that? Does someone? I'm going to try to move to a specific example. Yes, and why don't you say your name?
So people know.
Yeah.
I'm at SW109, I'm a part-time PhD student here at King's. I was a student of Professor Halley at Harvard about 13 years ago.
Right.
And I specialise in lesbian and gay asylum claims. I've just been returned back from a conference in Madrid where we're looking at credibility assessment in asylum claims. And as lawyers, I think we elevate ourselves on a platform when it comes to refugee protection, saying it's all about the law. But one thing in my practice is that it's all about the narrative of the client. Because if my client doesn't provide me with a narrative, I can't, and credible, what a credible narrative is, without a credible narrative, I can't assist them in relation to a refugee convention. Whatever I say about the law, if my clients give me the facts, I can't connect the two together. So I think it's important to also realise that with what we're saying about the law, it all really does depend on the individual we're trying to assist, and being able to give that individual the voice and the space to be heard. I think that's very important to be able to look at as well.
How would you tie that to, so in part, you seem to think about changes in the law. For example, I was going to move to the example of international criminal law, international humanitarian law, which Janet has written on. It's partly the law that's changing.
Yeah.
I think the comment is partly about the reality of the relationship of that law to the individuals and their stories and the advocates, which certainly there are examples of in the cases. But credibility itself is a legal standard, I think, that you've talked about why should we not trust. How do we impugn, how do we give some presumption of truth to a claim of being raped? How do we think about those questions in wartime situations? But maybe we could shift to that.
Okay.
So let me just say, I want to speak here. Prabha recommended one article to me that I would clearly put on my top 10 reading list to give people. And I think Rape in Berlin is a simply beautiful article, a simply classic article. You'll find it in 2008 in the Melbourne Law Journal. It's a really wonderful article in so many ways. One part of that is simply to talk about the triumph. Before we get to Rape in Berlin, what is the triumph that you talk about in international? So feminists approach international criminal law, they approach international humanitarian law, and they have some partial triumphs in that.
Yeah, the feminists were the vox clamante in deserto, the voice crying in the desert at the time of the initial formation of the ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and the ICTR, Rwanda. They were trying to get in, they were trying to even get their letters put in the inbox of the judges and of the people drawing up the statutes. And they were non-members. And in my parallel, much more legally framed paper, Rape at Rome, I tell the story about how they organized coalitions, global coalitions, centralized those, expertized those, and sent them to the Rome Conference that established the International Criminal Court, and had a deep campaign for a very specific set of highly motivated rule changes that they wanted to get out of specifically war crimes and crimes against humanity. They knew what they wanted, and it changed over time during the process. But one of the things that was so interesting was that they were right with Amnesty International and 4 other NGOs in the central committee of the pro-court coalition that really ran that conference. That's getting insight, and it happened in 10 years. So that was a ratification of my sense that governance feminism can happen. And it was a little bit like we're just having spring in Boston right now. You guys already have it. And you stand in front of a bush and you're watching the leaves come out, and you think, if I just stand in front of this tree long enough, I will see the leaves come out of the branch. And that 10 years is a really short time. So they had they had a very specific agenda, and to me the big surprise was how much it was a radical feminist agenda carried by liberal feminists who normally you would expect to be at loggerheads, but they found a way to work together, and they carried the day on many rules. Rape is now a predicate act of crimes against humanity, predicate acts of war crimes. You don't have to, it's not just evidence. The ICC is hardly, I think, brought any significant prosecutions that don't involve a charge of some kind of sexual wrongdoing. They got sexual violence in there. They tried to get gender violence in there, which was a different concept and they didn't, but they got it into the kind of ancillary provisions. So those are, high little beachheads for the idea of gender violence, that they have specific meanings. They're really smart. They know what they're doing, and they're moving. But they got immense pushback on gender violence, and couldn't get it in. The Pope didn't like it. The Islamically oriented countries didn't like it. Why? Because they knew that the radical feminist vision of gender violence included polygamy. So the politics of it was deep and emerged in the. So I just thought this was all very amazing, and it is a partial triumph. And then if you look at the kind of the rules of evidence and the rules of procedure, which are the kind of spin-off documents that you don't quite know how they apply, they got even more in those, and they got even more in the footnotes to those. So, it was a very intense campaign, and I just thought the high watermark was well worth tracing, and that's what I tried to do in Rape at Rome.
Right, and so part 2 of Rape in Berlin sort of very quickly points back at Rape at Rome.
Yeah.
At the other piece.
And I wrote that before I did the full treatment.
And then, but Rape at Berlin, then asks everyone to reflect on this partial triumph.
Yeah.
Which I think is an amazing step to take. What are you asking people to reflect on?
Well, the fact that it's armed conflict means that there's a lot of death. And there's a lot of intentional and legal world destroying going on. Worlds are being destroyed. And I was aware that the radical feminist line isn't precisely, but tracks very closely to the idea that rape is the fate worse than death, which is a Victorian paternalist idea, but they're actually willing to say it in modern terms. And so they would want a prosecution in the former Yugoslavia. There was nothing but sexual violence. They would call a rape camp when it had rapes in it, and men were dying. And I just thought, wow, I'm not good enough for this. I'm not up to speed. I don't even know how to do it, right? And so
How to do what? How to think
talk
about
that.
Yeah.
And so, and I still don't think I have anything like a mastery of this, but my brother brought to my attention a diary of a woman who was in Berlin when it fell to the Soviets. Well, it claims to be a diary. That itself is a controversial thing to call it. And she was constantly asking about the rape-death equivalence and the rape-rape equivalence. She said, well, here would be one tagline about rape-death. The women in her neighborhood, as the Soviet, she was in part of the Berlin, it was taken over by the Soviets. The women had a joke that better Ruski on top than a Yank overhead. And what they meant by that was better to be raped by a Soviet soldier than carpet bombed by what they thought was the American Air Force. Okay. When her boyfriend got back from the Soviet front and heard these jokes, he abandoned her. Because she was supposed to say that rape was the fate worse than death. If he had died, that would have been in service. But her rape was the thing that he wanted her to hold on to. And she wanted to let it go. Or let it partially go. I think it was working on that is the texture of the diary. Um, but also the rape equivalent. So her first rape was, the commandant was saying, the Soviet commander was saying, don't do it, it's against the ukaze Stalina, you can't rape them. And the Soviet soldier knocked him aside. No, there's no way of knowing whether this really happened. This is a story, right? And said, and I love this line, tells you so much, they took my sister.
The Soviet says.
Yeah, the
Soviet
Soviet soldier said that the German soldiers took his sister. And so he virtually had to rape her. So that's, anybody coming from the 17th century knows revenge, knows how the revenge is a mirroring, it's a literary form done through violence. And her, so there was a rape to rape equivalence, and she had a line from Aeschylus that in the end, the sum total of tears is the same. And I just thought that this was such a release from the zone where you had to be for or against rape or for or against death, or I just thought that the pros and cons were so overwhelming me, and that this fed me into a zone of ambiguity and second thoughts and mirrorings, and which I do think are part of this zone. So one of the questions I end up asking is, you make it more criminal, do you make it more valuable to do? And
Do you weaponize?
Yeah, and I don't think that question got asked inside feminist circles, but I do come to the criminalization question with that. What about the rapes that will be motivated precisely by its hyper-injurious, the assumptions of its hyper-injurious characteristics? Yeah, so hard questions.
Well, and it's very hard, let me just say, to summarize this I'm putting you on the spot here, in terms of summarizing a really wonderful literary examination of this text, and then thinking about responsibility for this voice in the desert. And again, if it's inexpressible in your terms, to think about some of these ambiguities, it's so easy to have a very clear voice out of the desert. But if you really take responsibility for all the implications of your clarity, then you dragged back into the ambiguities at a certain point.
I think that's.
Or
I'm
you
really
disagree?
glad that it's not true anymore that you can run an international humanitarian law, international criminal law system, and forget the rapes. That had to be achieved. That was right. But having achieved that, having moved inside that system, I think we want feminist thought there and feminist actors there to take responsibility for the messiness of how those prohibitions function. So one of my colleagues was out in the rural Colombia, the country, Colombia with the O, and she was sent out there to do the rapes in the armed conflict in Colombia, and she ran into a woman who said, "My rapes were really bad, but it was much worse to lose my farm and my animals." And I think it's a light, better, a rusky on top. There's something about comparative here. There's something about what's better than what, what's worse than what, and I think that understanding that as lawyers, when we come with our narrative, we may not hear all the jokes and the ambiguities that structure the situation, and so that's.
So can I open this up to questions, to discussion?
This is going to make a little explosive sound, I know, from being here for 2 days. Yeah,
Are there
very quiet one.
people who have a question, please?
We can wait.
We can wait. Yes. So nice and loud, and please say your name.
Yeah, I'm Helen Rees.
Hi.
Hi. When you were saying about, from what it was you said now, I wasn't ready to ask a question, but I thought I'd leave in.
No, good. Thank you.
There's something, yes, it's when you were saying about, men are dying in the camp and somehow the rapes become the focus, or I'm slightly not getting that right, but along those lines. It reminded me of a line in John Becker's book about, where he makes the point about the Titanic, and he says, the feminist kind of view of the Titanic is help, innocent women and children are drowning.
Right.
And that made me then wonder about, because what I find very interesting about your work is the way that you sort of straddled feminism. So, you describe yourself as kind of a flickering feminist.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wondered how you manage that, and how you feel that works for you when you sort of compare your work with somebody like John Feckerter or Joel Best, or the women who have been described as kind of the dissident feminists, who sort of, from my perspective, have some of the same concerns that you have.
Yeah.
See some of the same processes, but they've taken the decision to sort of step away from feminism and step outside of it and adopt a more, a different orientation towards feminism from the one that you've had. I'm just very interested in that way. You sort of got a foot in and a foot out, and I don't know, maybe that's not how you see yourself, but that's the impression I got from reading Split Decisions and your
Yeah. That's so interesting that you see that book that way, because I wrote a book called Split Decisions, How and Why to Take a Break from Feminism, and it's very frequently been read as though I'm saying feminism is something we can do without, and it's over, and we don't need it, and it was a disaster, and we need to move on. And I don't think that. But at the same time, I think that as a matter of intellectual adventure, work on sex, my remit is sex, sexuality, gender, and the family, right? That's the range. And I think it's very helpful to look at it as a feminist and then take those glasses off and look at it as a person who's looking for the interests of sexual minorities, and to take that off and to say, how did we ever get to the word sexual minorities, and why are we talking that way when certain deviant acts are extremely widespread? And maybe we should be talking about sexual majorities and the downtrodden sexual majorities, and and so, but I'm with the take a break idea, is that the idea that your theory will predetermine your reality, that your theory will tell you what you can and can't see, and if you're a person like me with regrets and yearnings that aren't captured by any one formulation, the taking a break move can mean that you can see the same thing differently. Then you make your decision, your political decision, right? What do I want out of this revisable thing? So I've been trying to stay in a take a break position, actually, because it's been really obnoxious to many people, and that is very gratifying to me at some level. The kid who slipped the little card under a parent's door that said 10 reasons not to believe in God, like, take that. I'm holding the position, right? And and it's a position. It's not identical with a person. In fact, this goes back to Milton. Milton said in Areopagitica, there's a great line, never to be forgotten, the person is always to, the author is always to be distinguished from the person he introduces. And that is that gap that one wants, I think one wants that gap for some mobility.
Can I ask how this relates in a more, how does this relate
Is
to
that
your image as a
responsive?
scholar?
Yeah.
I'm
Go
sorry,
ahead,
so I
David, I'm
don't
sorry.
mean to,
Just-
so please come back with
Please.
your question, but how does this relate to your self-image as someone engaged in scholarship? Is the flickering, taking the glasses off a way to, is there something about your role
Yeah.
in wanting to do that? Or is it the note under the door?
Well, I did spend 10 years of my life writing about God. I'm not able to write politically unmotivated scholarship. So, but one thing I hate is scholarship that is so driven by advocacy that it can't see what it's excluding, and it can't see its own spin, and it can't see the interest group right outside the frame. And so, you know, I've just been constantly searching through especially as I move through different legal zones, trying to figure out how to write in a way that has a level of descriptive rightness, and a level of political commitment, and it's a balancing act.
So the person should be distinguished from the author, but the author should be aware of the person they're putting forth.
Yeah, I mean, Milton was very careful to have a pamphleteer self and a poet self, and he kept them really far apart. And when I was initially trained, you only read the poet, and then there were the tracts, you know, and the polemics, and and a whole 12-volume heretical statement of unchristian doctrine. You know, so he divided himself up into genres in order to deploy and use the different parts of himself. And I came to that kind of late. I thought that was pretty cool to find out. Well, I think all of us do that in some way, but scholarship can be a holding environment for that kind of effort, a good
I'm
environment.
sorry, did you want to
Is that
follow
it?
on that?
Yeah, Helen, did I answer your
Oh, no,
question?
you definitely answered it. I mean, if I can, I'll ask.
Yeah, please.
I just wondered, I'm following on from that.
Nice and loud for everybody.
Sorry. Who you feel you're writing to or for? Do you feel that you're trying to write for feminists? Do you
Always.
feel that's your audience? And you're
Part
trying to-
of.
Right.
Yeah, part of. I mean, there were 10 years, less than that. I got a huge amount out of identifying with gay men. It was just an immense change in what you could see. You could see that feminist-inspired sex harassment laws, it was working in the law schools and in higher education in the United States, was causing the gay male professors to have to keep their doors open all the time. Because it was always, I mean, it's less so now, but really dangerous for them to make eye contact. You know, eye contact alone could be sexual harassment in the early days of the out gay man in the legal academy. And so I was just very surprised that the feminists didn't care about that. You know, like, these were my boys. And you know, when I got my hair cut, and I would tell the guy cutting my hair, you know, cut it so short that I got called sir for 2 weeks. And I think that was just an amazingly a frame-breaking experience for me, and led me to look at the trends in queer theory that were able to stretch as what had been for many players an indigenously and perpetually feminist thing, really had to stretch and break to encompass more and more. And that challenged the conceptual tools. And another thing, Helen, I'll say is, how can you be wrong? How can you change your mind? What would it be like to change your affiliations? Could we do a little bit more of talking about that? So that was part of it too.
Other questions? Nikki. I'm sorry, you're holding it. Nikki.
I'm a lecturer here in criminal law. I'm going to take us back a little bit again, back to international criminal law, if that's all right.
Yeah.
But I spent the morning actually reading a piece by Halley, who's a researcher at LSE. But she's been doing deep ethnographic work in northern Uganda with a group of women who've been subject to series of sexual abuses.
Yeah. I don't
She
know the
argues
word,
that-
so.
She argues that what they're prioritizing, particularly, specifically rape, so obviously it's an area that international criminal courts been involved in. But what she's arguing is that for these women, the experience is very similar to what you're arguing in rape of women. So there are different rapes. And
Yeah.
that there's a social value that's being, for those women, there's a social value that's being attached to, there's a value that's being attached to social harmony that is given priority. So it's different. If a soldier's raped me, I want accountability. But if my brother-in-law's raped me, I don't. Because the social cost for accountability for my brother-in-law is enormous, whereas the social cost for a soldier who I don't know is much lower.
Interesting.
And so my question is, if there's been this huge fight to get the law in, okay, to get criminal law in to
Yeah.
these discussions, how do we get it out? So how do you start to make the argument
Yeah.
shouldn't be prosecuting the brother-in-law? Because yes, he raped her, but the social cost for her is so enormous that, but she does want the prosecution of the soldier.
What a great question. Well, I don't think there's any unringing that bell. There's no uncracking that egg. There's no, we are now in a zone where the decision not to prosecute is a very costly decision for a prosecutor to make. And so prosecutors in the United States have their desks stacked thick with sexual assault accusations that they don't believe in, but they're not going to dismiss. And that's something new. So those guys are all going to live out the statute of limitations under that. They're indicted, but there's never going to be a trial. And we have women saying which of their rapes are prosecution worthy and which aren't, which I think is an immense, upgrade in the level of agency and expression, but a certain loss of refinement, right? I mean, I know my brother-in-law, so it will cost him a lot, and I don't know somebody else, so it won't cost him anything. That's something you can travel to a different perspective and get a different assessment of that. And so I just think this part of it is so difficult and so interesting. And we're having this gigantic thing in the United States now about sexual assault on campus, and and schools are being held to account for not prosecuting, not taking students through the full disciplinary procedure for sexual assault accusations, and I think it's posing institutions of higher education the question of, do they need to open up, in the administration, a branch of criminal prosecution for their own students, in which the death penalty is expulsion, and so I just think we have to get in and deal, right? I don't mean to say that my Colombian researcher who got her quote is the final word, right? Listening to those most affected is a very good left slogan, and it's a good organizing device, and it's a good thing to do if you can figure out who they are. But you already have to figure out who they are in order to ask them what they will have to say. So the responsibility remains with those of us who have listening power to decide what listening we're going to do. I would love to teach a whole course on this. You know, I mean, this would be well worth looking at.
What term? Do you want
Yeah,
to do that?
when should we do that? And so I also think that there is pressure on victims to prosecute that comes from family members, that comes from social groups that they belong to, that is about the symbolic value of prosecution rather than about the restorative effect on the victim. There's also the fact that there will be a defense. You know, that we lawyers know this. There'll be a defense. Some of these guys will be acquitted. That won't resolve your sense of non-recognition, right? When George Zimmerman, I'm in England, I'm not in the United States, when your favorite criminal defendant who you think must be convicted in order to vindicate your social justice instincts gets acquitted, I would suggest try to remember not to be surprised, because there will be a defense. I think getting down into that is something that we lawyers can bring, and the ethnographers can bring, and we can learn a lot. And this would be fully within the governance feminism project to get into that. Yeah, that would
That
be.
the legal system is only a part.
Is only a part. Yeah, the social movement mobilizers are. I think it would be good to bring in a literary part where you would think about the role of representation. There are some studies about the early run-up to the Yugoslavian conflict about the nationalist use of rape of our women by their men as a reason to have the conflict. Okay. Can we recycle that back into our awareness when we're prosecuting? And if so, what would that cause us to do? So those questions, I would be hard to put together, of course, but I think the time is kind of here for it.
So, you know, when the Eritrean-Ethiopian War ended in 1998 to 2000, and there was both a territorial commission and a claims commission, and one of the big successes the diplomats would ascribe to that was simply breaking the moment of revenge. That the cycle was so hard that they went into a process of just diplomatically talking to each other for 5-6 years to work through those two commissions. And something in that cycle allowed other parts of society to start trying to do some things. But an interesting function simply to breaking cycles.
Yeah, that's, the no peace without justice, no justice without peace, those slogans don't work for me. You can get justice that eliminates the possibility of peace. And you can get peace that eliminates the possibility of justice. And so what to do? And I do think that the organizing ideas that brought the feminists to the fore at Rome won't work if the interests of peace are to be put on the table. Those ideas were the idea. Here is the central animating idea, and I think, and here I do have a rather. I will say it. I am opposed to this. I am opposed to this. The idea is that rape in war and rape in so-called peacetime are continuous. It's all the war on women. And that's why you can never punish enough, because it's so big. That you need symbolic victories. You would even be happy to convict some innocent men because you need to send the signal that this is, and the frame is pre-designed to leave out the other social interests that are at stake in an armed conflict. And what do armed conflicts do? They get themselves mobilized by setting up frames that leave out social interests that are left out of their frames. So there seems something very unpacific about some of the moves. Yeah.
Nikki, did you have something further? No?
So yeah, let's find each other, and I'd like to see this work. It'd
Yeah.
be great to see it.
Other questions? Please, right? So nice and loud for everyone.
Yeah.
I'm not sure everyone can
My
hear in
name
the
is
back.
Penelope, and I wanted to bring it back slightly to the theoretical. And you were sort of mentioning that rape was considered, could be considered under a patriarchal stance, if you like, worse than death.
Yeah.
And I was wondering also how that connected with the fact that rape can actually lead to birth, and birth of a child, and the fact that rape can be generational. I mean, it's plausible that some rapists in parts of the world are actually themselves born of a rape, because in parts of the world it's been going on for decades. And I was wondering also what your opinion was of Adriana Cavalera's theory that Western civilization is basically quite matricidal, and what for you sort of the connection is between feminism and motherhood and the role of the mother
Oh wow.
and matricide.
Wow.
So if you can see that there's kind
So
of...
can everyone hear?
Can everybody
Should we-
hear the question?
So maybe you can sort of restate the question. And
You tell me your name again, Penelope.
Yeah.
Penelope asks, rape can produce babies. It can produce the desire for abortion. I'm riffing a little bit. It can produce new generations of people who can go on to rape and be raped. And the intergenerational character of the rape story. And then the second part of it was the large part of feminism, which is about I make a distinction between the parts of feminism that are primarily concerned with sexuality, concerned with work, concerned with motherhood. That's a bandwidth of feminism, but there's a big overlap between the violence, death, rape part and matricide. Well, did I get it, capture it a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, Cavalera's contention is that, that perhaps, women and birth, has been suppressed, if you like. That's, I think, as I've understood it, part of her feminism.
Yeah.
Is to say that the masculine world is very matricidal, that is how, because it's against birth, because it's frightened of death, and so that it's always put the emphasis on death. And I just found it very interesting that in this discourse, there was a lot of emphasis on death, and you were sort of saying, well, the men got killed, whereas the women are only being raped or being raped.
I didn't say only being
But
raped.
They were saying that they were saying actually that you were saying in fact, yeah, sorry, I misquoted you there. You were saying in fact that the fuss was about the fact that it was rape camps, and so there was this kind of criminalization of the rape. At that point, that the death was being taken for granted. But in a lot of international criminal law, it is war crimes. It's about death. It's basically about the threat of death. I mean, in those war rapes, there is the threat of death.
Wow, you've put so much on the table. Could people hear
It's very complex, yeah. Multidimensional, I'm afraid.
I think that the woman in Berlin was very worried that she would be pregnant. She was raped repeatedly. She figured out how to get protection by forming an alliance with with the most powerful man she could get. You got to read this book. It is an amazing story about how marital domesticity very quickly reasserted itself among the German women and the Soviet soldiers who kind of claimed each other for a kind of bourgeois. They swept, they smoked cigars, they had drinks, they laughed. And then the Soviet army blew away. There went the food, and the woman in Berlin started to starve, and she started to worry. And then she was under the occupation calorie rationing. And so the last 40 pages of the book are about how hungry she was. And taking 1 grain of sugar and putting it on her tongue at a time. That was the Allies. And one of the parts of that is worrying about being pregnant and she happened not to be pregnant, but other women were, and they were getting underground abortions, or they were trying to get above ground with it, And I really think that this is an interesting whole set of politics. And it's subject to some rather nationalist strands of interpretation. I'm going to get you pregnant with a Serbian baby. And the baby won't, what, is that some kind of 17th century idea that the baby is made up 100% of the male genes? I think we've gone beyond it. So, well, okay, try to peel that back a bit. So I don't know about the idea that there is a male society and there is a male culture and that it has thoughts and that it has intentions about or consolidated monolithic fears of women's generative capacity and therefore murdering women is a good idea. I just don't see that. The reason that Soviet soldier raped the woman was he was mad about his sister. He wasn't afraid of her generative capacity. He was enraged about her injury. So I the rape camps. I wasn't saying that. The old style thing to do is to emphasize the death and the rape camps of the men and to forget the women. Now the women are back on the agenda. They were raped, and the feminist push was to have rape camp cases that were solely about sexual violation. My point is to remember that in that very rape camp there were men who died. There were also men who were brutalized. There were men who were brutalized by being made to brutalize. There was plenty of injury to go around, and I think I would spread out the hypothesis about the character of maternal power and maternal injury. My impulse would be, you're going to see, if you go to the maternal segment, a similar capacity of the dynamic to fragment in the way that the rape piece has fragmented through. So yeah, we're not really talking right now about a book about mothers. And let me give you Robin West, Cultural Feminist United States. Mothers have immense amounts of power over their children. Okay, yeah, they do. Can I stop there? And what do they do with that? Well, some of them kill their children, and some of them raise their children and brought you all into the state of being that you could get into this wonderful college and come here. And so there's not one mother, just as there's not one rape.
So I have a very off-the-wall question, but yes, please. Nice and loud for everyone.
Yes, my name is Daniela Notch. Thanks for your talk. My question really relates around Doris Voss' argument that there's been sort of a hyper-visible focus on sexual violence, which I think is very interesting.
Yeah.
And we see it happen in international criminal tribunals all the time, and also more widely in the media discourse. But secondly, my question is around the role of ethnicity, because what I find has happened very frequently in prosecutions is that there's been an elision of ethnicity in sexual violence, so that, in other words, sexual violence is viewed through the prism of ethnicity.
Right.
So people were raped because they were Croat in the Yugoslav context, or because they were Bosnian Muslim, again in that same context.
And then their pregnancies are a genocide, and yeah,
Exactly.
right.
So what is your view of that elision, number one, and to what extent maybe you hold governance feminism responsible for in any way contributing to that view, which is, I think, very narrow and very exclusive and
Well,
incorrect.
you know, I would point you to another piece on this theme that inspired me deeply was Karen Engel's Feminism and Its Discontents, which really does capture the way in which the feminist rape process, which she wrote during the process that I look back on in Rape at Rome, and that now is ongoing. Okay, so but was willing to use those ethnicities and actually, you know, she diagnoses the effort to make the rapes into a genocide as an ethnic nationalist, a kind of collapse of feminist vigilance against ethnic nationalism, and I really think that this is a place where we want to have people who can take the lenses off and put them back on, and you know, travel inside and outside of the feminist frame. It's very, one of the things we realized writing the governance feminism introduction is that there are very few times that women break out into violent war against men. Just think about it, how often has that happened? But ethnicities break out into violent war against ethnicities chronically. And we should be very concerned about the role of feminism entering into those zones without the anxieties that those conflicts should be producing. So with that, and that war on women framing is really good at forgetting this. So yeah, I think that that's a good reason to have feminism, but also to be willing to take a break from feminism. I mean, one of the things that's kind of sad about this is you can get a lot of indignation going about sexual wrongs that you can't mobilize easily about economic maldistributions. And there is a pornographic dimension to making the sexual injury the lead story all the time. And I even think, I hate to tell you, but I think that there's a lot of pornographic pleasure taken in it. And so, when do we stop, right? When do we move back from that? And I don't mean to say they're only the rapes. You know, I think that and the woman in Berlin was really interested in differentiating the rapes. There were women, young adolescents whose fathers would come to them with a rope after they were raped and just said, "You know what you're supposed to do." There were women who would jump out of windows. There were women whose psyches were just mowed down. And there were other women who were determined to laugh their way through the whole damn thing and not apologize. And, you know, what what to do about that, right? So I'm not minimizing. I'm really not minimizing, but I do acknowledge that the boundary with ethnicity is a very fraught one. Put it that way. Let's talk about something easy.
So let's switch topics entirely for a moment. So I don't know what I'm switching to. So it may be very fraught. Who knows?
Back to Milton.
Well, that's.
No, you go, David.
Yeah.
Where
Well, I was
where
going
you
to
go?
switch to another strand of your work, where you speak of family exceptionalism. Is
Oh.
that?
Yeah, family law exceptionalism. That's
Yeah.
yeah.
And could you just comment on that? We are nearing time.
Okay, so be
Maybe
short.
any sort of closing message you have for us as well? So-
Oh dear, time has flown. Okay, so together with Carrie Riddick and Brenda Kosman, Carrie's in the room, you can talk to her about it. Brenda's not here. We got a thing going about family law exceptionalism, about the way that the family is special. And it's special in culture, it's special in economics, it's special in law, and we got interested in all the ways that it's special in religion, and it's also countervailingly not special. So Gary Becker writes his groundbreaking book on economic theories of the family, and that's what, he gets a Nobel Prize for. And so we're interested in the way that the family is deployable as both exceptional and as absolutely continuous with everything else. And that's a very powerful fund of historical and analytic, there's a lot there. For me, it's partly motivated by, I'm a family law teacher. I think the family is an amazingly important distributive institution. It's an amazingly important affective institution. But guess what? It's so easy to forget. So we're trying to figure out what are the systematic ways that it can be forgotten, and what are the ways of bringing it back into the discussion. What do you pay when you do that? So that's the family law exceptionalism part. Certainly, the family is exceptional in colonialism. It became, through a set of ideas that we give the story of, the thing that the national elites could keep. Well, the economic became the thing that the global free, the aim for a global free trade zone would be European law, and so that has a continually recurring capacity to surprise us and to make women national in the way that men are internet. So there's just so much there. You wouldn't. I'm glad you brought it up, but I can't possibly do it justice.
Well, it's a rich vein for people to think about.
Yeah, I think if people want to talk about that, it's kind of different from the violence project. Yeah. So as for parting words, I've had an extremely rich 2 days here. There's clearly a place of intense intellectual ferment and high level lawyering. And I just really want to thank you, and I want to thank Prabha for letting me come. And I would love to be in dialogue with any of you on any of the things that have come up.
Let me
Just love it.
One thing, Janet, I find your vision so clear. And what I find ironic or lovely, inexpressible, is that you say you find clarity by taking your glasses off and putting on a different pair of glasses. And I think it just kind of shows, to me, that there's just this strong message that, in fact, our eyes blind us to so many things. And
thank you.
We
That's
have to
so
keep
really true.
We just have to keep moving, keep looking in different ways, and work very hard to see this very elusive, inexpressible reality
thank you.
around us. So
Thank you.
please join me in thanking Janet for this
Thank you.
conversation.
Thank you all.